The long high mountains had earned their reputation in blood. American forces called this region the Devil's Playground. Vietnamese peasants called it the place where spirits walk. Australian SAS operators called it simply the Long Highs, spoken in the same tone a man might use to name his executioner. This jagged spine of jungle-covered granite rose from the coastal plains of Phuoc Tuy province like broken teeth from diseased gums. Every cave concealed a weapons cache. Every trail hid a booby trap. Every shadow could erupt into automatic fire without warning. The North Vietnamese army had transformed these mountains into an underground fortress over nearly a decade of continuous occupation. Tunnel complexes stretched for kilometers beneath the surface. Supply depots held enough rice and ammunition to sustain battalion-strength operations for months. Field hospitals operated in caverns so deep that B-52 strikes could not reach them. Communication centers coordinated guerrilla activities across 3 provinces. The Long Highs were not merely enemy territory, they were enemy infrastructure. And in August of 1969, Australian intelligence had identified something that changed everything. Signals intercepts had detected unusual radio traffic emanating from a previously unmapped sector of the northern Long Highs. Pattern analysis suggested a command and control node of significant importance. Subsequent aerial reconnaissance revealed nothing but unbroken jungle canopy. Whatever was generating those signals was buried deep beneath the green. Australian Task Force headquarters in Nui Dat needed eyes on the ground. They needed confirmation before committing precious air assets to what might be a decoy operation. They needed a patrol that could penetrate the most heavily defended enemy sanctuary in Phuoc Tuy province, locate the target, and extract without compromise. They needed Phantom 6. Sergeant Colin Fletcher had not planned on becoming a soldier. Growing up on a cattle station 300 kilometers west of Rockhampton, his childhood had been measured in drought cycles and livestock prices. His father had worked the same land his grandfather had cleared. His mother had taught school in a one-room building that served 11 children, from 5 families spread across 2,000 square kilometers of scrubland. Colin had learned to track feral pigs before he learned to read. He had learned to survive on minimal water before he learned to drive. The outback had been his first instructor in the arts of patience, observation, and endurance. But the outback had not taught him to hunt men. That education came later. Fletcher had enlisted in the Australian Army in 1964, 3 months after his 19th birthday. The recruiting sergeant in Rockhampton had promised him travel, adventure, and skills that would serve him for life. The sergeant had not mentioned Vietnam. In 1964, Australia's commitment to the conflict remained limited to military advisors and logistics specialists. The combat deployments would come later, after Fletcher had already completed basic training, infantry school, and the grueling selection course for the Special Air Service Regiment. SAS selection broke men with mathematical precision. Of the 112 candidates who began Fletcher's course, only 17 completed it. The others were returned to their units with various degrees of physical and psychological damage. Some recovered fully. Some carried the scars forever. The selection cadre made no apologies. They were not building soldiers. They were building something else entirely. Something that could function when every system failed. Something that could think when thinking seemed impossible. Something that could survive when survival defied logic. Fletcher had not been the strongest candidate. He had not been the fastest. He had not been the most aggressive or the most technically proficient. But he had possessed something the instructors recognized immediately. He had possessed the ability to simply continue. When other candidates collapsed from exhaustion, Fletcher kept moving. When other candidates surrendered to despair, Fletcher kept planning. When other candidates broke under psychological pressure, Fletcher retreated into a quiet place inside himself where pressure could not reach. The instructors had a name for this quality. They called it the gray man syndrome. The ability to become invisible, to endure without drama, to persist without recognition. It was the most valuable trait a long-range reconnaissance operator could possess, and it would save his life in the Long High Mountains. The patrol inserted by helicopter at 0430 hours on the morning of August 11, 1969. 5 men descended from the hovering Iroquois into a landing zone so small that the rotor blades clipped vegetation on 3 sides. The insertion had been planned to coincide with the artillery harassment mission 3 kilometers to the south. The distant thunder of 105mm shells would mask the helicopter noise. The pre-dawn darkness would conceal the patrol's initial movement. Everything had been calculated to give Fletcher's team the maximum chance of undetected penetration. The 5 men who touched Vietnamese soil that morning represented the concentrated expertise of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment. Fletcher led as patrol commander. Corporal Danny Nguyen served as second-in-command and primary linguist, his Vietnamese heritage providing invaluable cultural intelligence. Trooper William Mackenzie handled communications, carrying the PRC-77 radio that represented their only lifeline to extraction. Trooper James Rutherford served as patrol medic, his pack weighted with trauma supplies and amphetamines for emergency use. And Trooper Robert Wallace brought up the rear as tail end Charlie, his senses tuned to detect any pursuit. Their mission parameters were straightforward. Penetrate 12 kilometers into the northern Long Highs. Locate and confirm the suspected command facility. Report coordinates for airstrike. Extract via pre-planned helicopter pickup on day 3. Total duration, 72 hours. Water allocation, 3 canteens per man, supplemented by whatever streams or seeps they could locate en route. Food allocation, minimal. Australian SAS doctrine emphasized traveling light. A heavy pack made noise. Noise attracted attention. Attention meant contact. Contact meant compromise. And compromise in the Long Highs meant something no training could prepare you for. The first 24 hours proceeded according to plan. Fletcher's patrol moved through the jungle at a pace that would have seemed impossibly slow to conventional infantry. They covered less than 4 kilometers in 12 hours of movement, but they covered those 4 kilometers without leaving a single trace of their passage. No broken branches, no disturbed leaf litter, no boot prints in soft earth. The Australian SAS had perfected the art of ghost walking, and Fletcher's team executed that art with surgical precision. But even ghosts can make mistakes. The error occurred at approximately 1400 hours on day 2. Mackenzie was adjusting his radio antenna when his boot dislodged a small stone. The stone rolled perhaps 2 meters down a slight incline before coming to rest against a fallen log. The sound it made was barely audible. A soft click, like a finger tapping a wooden table. Under normal circumstances, such a sound would vanish into the ambient noise of the jungle. Birds calling, insects humming, leaves rustling. The forest provided constant acoustic cover for minor disturbances. But circumstances in the Long Highs were never normal. The North Vietnamese army soldier who heard that stone was approximately 40 meters from Fletcher's patrol. He was part of a 4-man trail-watching team positioned to detect exactly this kind of infiltration. He had been sitting motionless in a concealed position for 6 hours, his ears attuned to any sound that did not belong to the natural rhythm of the forest. The click of stone against wood was wrong. It was too sharp, too isolated, too deliberate in its accident. The soldier did not react immediately. He had been trained by veterans who had survived French ambushes at Dien Bien Phu. He knew that hasty response to suspected enemy presence often resulted in revealing your own position to a superior force. Instead, he remained frozen, his eyes scanning the vegetation ahead, his ears straining for any follow-up sound that might confirm or deny his suspicion. Fletcher felt the danger before he understood it. Some combination of peripheral vision, subconscious pattern recognition, and pure animal instinct told him that something in the jungle ahead had changed. He raised his left fist slowly, the signal for immediate halt. Behind him, 4 men froze mid-step, their bodies becoming statues wrapped in camouflage. For 90 seconds, nothing moved. The jungle held its breath. Then the bird calls started. The Vietnamese soldiers used bird calls for tactical communication. Different species, different messages. The call that echoed through the canopy at 14:03 hours was the signal for suspected enemy contact. Within minutes, that signal had been relayed to the nearest NVA company headquarters. Within an hour, 3 companies of North Vietnamese regulars were converging on the area. Within 2 hours, nearly 300 enemy soldiers were searching for 5 Australians who had made the mistake of moving 1 small stone. Fletcher understood immediately that extraction via the planned helicopter pickup was no longer possible. The enemy would be monitoring all potential landing zones. Any helicopter attempting approach would be engaged by concentrated anti-aircraft fire. His patrol had 2 options. They could attempt to break contact and move toward the coast, hoping to reach a naval extraction point. Or they could continue the mission, trusting that their ability to evade would outlast the enemy's ability to search. Fletcher chose to continue. This decision would later be analyzed extensively at SAS headquarters in Perth. Some officers considered it reckless. Others called it the defining moment of tactical brilliance in the regiment's Vietnam history. Fletcher himself, in debriefings conducted months later, described his reasoning in characteristically understated terms. The patrol had already penetrated 8 kilometers into enemy territory. The suspected command facility lay only 4 kilometers ahead. Retreating 12 kilometers through alerted enemy forces seemed no safer than advancing 4. And if they were going to risk everything regardless, they might as well accomplish the mission. But continuing the mission meant surviving without resupply for far longer than anyone had planned. The water situation became critical on day 3. Australian SAS doctrine allocated water consumption at approximately 2 liters per man per day under normal patrol conditions. Jungle operations in tropical heat could easily double that requirement. Fletcher's team had inserted with roughly 15 liters total. By the morning of day 3, they had consumed nearly 12 liters. And the streams marked on their maps had proven to be seasonal features that existed only during monsoon periods. In August, those stream beds held nothing but cracked mud and desperate memories of rain. Fletcher implemented emergency water discipline with immediate effect. Each man would consume no more than 200 milliliters per day. This was approximately 1/10 of the minimum recommended intake for sustained physical activity in tropical conditions. Medical science said this allocation was insufficient to maintain kidney function. Medical science said dehydration at this level would impair cognitive function within 48 hours. Medical science said 5 men could not survive 2 weeks on this ration. Medical science had not trained with the Australian SAS. The patrol continued moving on day 4. Their pace had slowed to less than 1 kilometer per 12-hour movement period. The enemy search pattern was intensifying. NVA companies swept through the jungle in coordinated lines, their spacing calculated to detect any human presence within their search corridor. Twice, Fletcher's team lay motionless while enemy soldiers passed within 10 meters of their position. Once, an NVA officer actually stepped over Rutherford's concealed body without realizing he had just crossed an Australian trooper. The psychological pressure of constant evasion combined with severe dehydration to create conditions that would break most men within hours. But Fletcher's team had been selected precisely for their ability to function under impossible conditions. They had been trained to retreat into that quiet internal space where fear and discomfort could not reach. They had been conditioned to continue when continuation defied reason, and they continued. Day 5 brought the first signs of serious physiological deterioration. Nguyen reported that his vision was becoming unreliable, with occasional blackouts lasting several seconds. Mackenzie noticed that his hands trembled when attempting fine motor tasks, like adjusting radio dials. Rutherford, the medic, recognized these symptoms as advanced dehydration combined with electrolyte depletion. He also recognized that treating these conditions required resources they did not possess. The only treatment was water, and water was precisely what they lacked. Fletcher made a decision that violated every protocol he had been taught. He ordered the patrol to halt for 24 hours. No movement. No mission progress. Complete rest in a concealed position while their bodies attempted to stabilize. This decision meant extending their time in enemy territory. It meant consuming another day of limited water reserves. It meant giving the NVA additional time to narrow their search pattern. But it also meant giving his men a chance to recover enough function to complete what still lay ahead. The concealment site Fletcher selected demonstrated why the SAS valued field experience over theoretical training. He chose a small depression in the jungle floor, barely 2 meters across, surrounded by fallen vegetation that had accumulated over several seasons. From above, the position was invisible. From ground level, the accumulated debris appeared to be nothing more than natural forest detritus. Fletcher's team crawled into this depression, pulled additional vegetation over their bodies, and disappeared from the physical world. For 24 hours they existed as ghosts. They did not speak. They barely moved. They consumed tiny sips of water at intervals calculated by Rutherford to maximize absorption. They urinated into plastic bags to avoid any scent that might attract tracking dogs. They controlled their breathing to minimize any sound that might penetrate the debris above them. They waited. And the enemy searched directly above their position without finding them. The NVA sweep that passed over Fletcher's concealment site on day 6 involved approximately 40 soldiers. They moved in a line formation with 3-meter spacing, their eyes scanning every shadow, their ears alert for any unusual sound. One soldier actually sat on the debris pile covering Mackenzie's legs while taking a brief rest break. He remained there for approximately 4 minutes, smoking a cigarette and speaking quietly with a comrade, completely unaware that an enemy soldier lay within arm's reach beneath his position. This moment would become legendary within the Australian SAS. In later years, Mackenzie would describe the experience with remarkable detachment. He explained that fear had simply become irrelevant by that point. His body had consumed so much stress hormone over the preceding days that the fear response had essentially burned out. What remained was a cold, mechanical focus on remaining absolutely still. His heartbeat had slowed to barely 40 beats per minute. His breathing had become so shallow that his chest barely moved. He had become, for those 4 minutes, something very close to actually deceased. After the NVA sweep passed, Fletcher allowed another 6 hours of rest before resuming movement. The patrol's condition had stabilized slightly, but remained critical. Water reserves now consisted of approximately 500 milliliters total, divided among 5 men. This represented roughly 1 day of consumption at their emergency rationing level. After that, they would be operating on nothing but determination and whatever moisture they could extract from vegetation. Day 7 marked a turning point in the mission. The patrol had finally reached the area identified by signals intelligence as the likely location of the enemy command facility. But what they found exceeded their most ambitious expectations. Hidden beneath triple canopy jungle, camouflaged with techniques that made it invisible to aerial observation, lay a complex that housed not merely a regional headquarters, but an entire NVA divisional command structure. Fletcher counted bunkers through his binoculars with growing disbelief. 12 hardened positions arranged in defensive perimeter. Multiple antenna arrays suggesting sophisticated communications capability. Vehicle tracks indicating regular supply traffic. And foot traffic patterns suggesting a permanent garrison of between 100 and 200 personnel. This was not a regional command node. This was a nerve center coordinating NVA operations across the entire southern sector of their operational area. The intelligence value of this discovery was almost incalculable. Australian and American forces had been searching for exactly this kind of target for years. Previous attempts to locate NVA divisional headquarters had consumed thousands of man-hours and dozens of casualties without success. And now, 5 dehydrated Australians lying in the vegetation less than 200 meters from the perimeter had found what entire battalions had failed to locate. But finding the target was only half the mission. Reporting its location required radio communication. And radio communication in the long highs presented challenges that could easily prove fatal. Mackenzie understood the problem immediately. The NVA monitored Allied radio frequencies with sophisticated equipment. Any transmission lasting more than approximately 90 seconds could be triangulated and located. A transmission from this position, surrounded by enemy forces, would bring immediate and overwhelming response. The patrol would be overrun before extraction assets could possibly reach them. Fletcher devised a solution that demonstrated why the SAS emphasized creative thinking alongside physical endurance. He ordered the patrol to move to a secondary position approximately 800 meters from their observation point. This position offered a direct line of sight to a ridge feature that could relay their signal to Australian headquarters. More importantly, it offered an escape route through a narrow ravine that the NVA sweep patterns had consistently avoided. The transmission itself was a masterpiece of compression. Mackenzie encoded the coordinates, target description, and recommended strike parameters into a burst message lasting less than 45 seconds. He transmitted at maximum power for minimum duration, then immediately shut down his radio and began moving. The patrol covered 300 meters in the first 10 minutes, far faster than their normal pace, driven by the knowledge that enemy direction-finding equipment was already plotting their position. The NVA response came within 20 minutes. Mortar rounds began falling on the transmission site, their characteristic whistle giving way to explosions that shattered trees and sent fragments screaming through the jungle. But Fletcher's patrol was already 500 meters distant, moving through the ravine he had identified. putting solid rock between themselves and the enemy response. Australian headquarters received the transmission with something approaching disbelief. The coordinates described a target of such value that confirmation seemed essential before committing strike assets. But confirmation meant additional communication. Additional communication meant additional risk, and Fletcher's patrol had already taken more risk than any reasonable mission profile would authorize. The decision to proceed without confirmation came from the commanding officer of the Australian task force personally. He had served with Fletcher on a previous deployment. He knew the sergeant's reputation for accurate intelligence, and he understood that requesting confirmation might cost the lives of 5 men who had already achieved the impossible. The airstrike launched at dawn on day 8. 2 squadrons of F-4 Phantom jets carrying high-explosive ordnance screamed across the long high mountains at treetop level. They released their weapons in a precisely calculated pattern, designed to saturate the target area with overlapping blast effects. Secondary explosions confirmed hits on ammunition storage facilities. Burning fuel indicated destruction of vehicle assets. And signals intelligence reported immediate cessation of all radio traffic from the target coordinates. The NVA divisional headquarters had ceased to exist, but Fletcher's patrol still faced 7 more days in the jungle before extraction would become possible. The airstrike had eliminated the command facility, but had also intensified enemy search operations to unprecedented levels. The NVA understood that the strike had been guided by ground observation. They understood that the observers were still somewhere in the mountains, and they were determined to find them. Day 9 brought the patrol to the absolute limits of human endurance. Water reserves had been exhausted on day 8. The men were now surviving on moisture extracted from vegetation and condensation, collected on plastic sheets during the brief pre-dawn hours. This provided perhaps 50 milliliters per man per day, enough to prevent immediate physiological collapse, not enough to maintain any meaningful physical capability. Rutherford, the medic, began documenting symptoms with clinical precision. Severe muscle cramping affecting all personnel. Confusion and disorientation occurring in episodes lasting several minutes. Visual and auditory hallucinations reported by 3 of 5 team members. Heart arrhythmias detected during routine pulse checks. These symptoms indicated dehydration levels approaching 40% of normal body fluid volume. Medical literature suggested that survival beyond this point was extremely unlikely without immediate intervention. But medical literature had not accounted for the particular qualities that defined Australian SAS selection. These men had been chosen precisely because they could function beyond normal human parameters. They had been conditioned to accept suffering as a temporary inconvenience rather than an existential crisis. They had been trained to focus on the next step, the next breath, the next heartbeat, without considering the accumulated weight of everything that had come before. Fletcher implemented a rotation system for consciousness. At any given time, 2 men would remain alert while 3 rested. The alert men would monitor for enemy approach and maintain orientation. The resting men would conserve every possible calorie of energy. This system meant that no individual had to maintain continuous awareness, reducing cognitive load during a period when cognitive function was severely compromised. Day 10 nearly ended the patrol. An NVA tracking team discovered signs of their passage from 3 days earlier. The trackers were skilled, probably trained by the same veterans who had hunted French paratroopers in the Northern Highlands. They followed the trail with patient precision, gradually closing the distance between themselves and Fletcher's exhausted team. Wallace detected the pursuit at approximately 1400 hours. His position at the rear of the patrol formation gave him responsibility for exactly this kind of threat. He signaled contact, and the patrol froze, assessing their options. The trackers were perhaps 200 meters behind, moving slowly but steadily toward their position. Standard doctrine called for immediate evasion at maximum speed. But maximum speed was no longer available to men who could barely walk. Fletcher made what he later described as the most difficult decision of his military career. He ordered an ambush. The logic was brutal but sound. The tracking team consisted of 4 men. Fletcher's patrol, despite their condition, retained functional weapons and the element of surprise. If the trackers were eliminated, the trail would go cold. If the trackers reported contact before being eliminated, the patrol would face the same overwhelming response they would face if discovered while evading. The ambush was executed with textbook precision, despite the patrol's degraded condition. Fletcher positioned his 4 men in an L-shaped formation covering the most likely approach route. He retained the point position himself, trusting his experience to identify the optimal moment for initiation. And when the lead tracker stepped into the engagement zone, Fletcher initiated with a single shot that began a cascade of controlled violence lasting less than 8 seconds. 4 NVA soldiers lay motionless when the shooting stopped. Fletcher's patrol had expended 17 rounds total. Every round had found its target. The engagement had been so brief and so clinical that the noise would register as insignificant at any distance beyond a few hundred meters. The bodies were left where they fell. Attempting to conceal them would require energy the patrol could not spare. Fletcher judged that the tracker's failure to report would create confusion about their fate. The NVA command would have to decide whether their team had simply gone silent due to radio problems, whether they had been lost, or whether they had been eliminated. That uncertainty would buy time, and time was the only resource Fletcher's patrol still possessed. Days 11 and 12 blurred together in the memories of the survivors. Movement became mechanical, driven by will rather than physical capability. The jungle transformed into an endless green maze that seemed to extend infinitely in every direction. Hallucinations became more frequent and more elaborate. Nguyen reported conversations with family members who were thousands of kilometers away. Mackenzie became convinced that his radio was receiving transmissions from Australian headquarters, despite knowing that he had removed the batteries to conserve weight. Rutherford documented these episodes in his medical notebook with increasingly erratic handwriting. But the patrol kept moving. The extraction point lay on the eastern edge of the long high mountains, where the jungle gave way to coastal plains that offered viable helicopter landing zones. Fletcher had selected this location during mission planning as a contingency option, in case the primary extraction point became compromised. What he had not anticipated was that reaching this point would require traversing terrain his team was no longer physically capable of crossing. The ridgeline that separated Fletcher's patrol from the extraction point rose nearly 400 meters above the surrounding jungle. The slope was steep enough to require hand-over-hand climbing in several sections. Under normal conditions, a fit patrol could cover this obstacle in perhaps 3 hours. Under current conditions, the obstacle appeared nearly insurmountable. Fletcher divided the climb into segments. 50 meters of elevation gain followed by 30 minutes of rest. This pace meant the ascent would require most of day 13. It also meant the patrol would be exposed on the ridgeline during daylight hours, visible to any enemy observation post within several kilometers. But there was no alternative. The climb began at dawn on day 13. Fletcher led, selecting handholds and footholds that his team could follow. Behind him, the other 4 men moved like automatons, their movements stripped of anything unnecessary by bodies operating at the absolute minimum of function. Twice, men lost their grip and slid several meters before catching themselves. Once, Wallace collapsed completely and had to be physically dragged by Nguyen and Rutherford until he regained enough consciousness to continue. The summit came at approximately 1400 hours. Fletcher allowed a brief rest while surveying the terrain ahead. The descent would be easier than the ascent but still required careful navigation, and at the base of the ridge, less than 3 kilometers distant, lay the extraction point that represented their only hope of survival. The descent took another 4 hours. By 1800 hours, Fletcher's patrol had reached the jungle fringe overlooking their designated landing zone. Mackenzie reassembled his radio with trembling hands and composed a brief message requesting immediate extraction. The transmission went out. The acknowledgement came back. Pickup confirmed for 0600 hours the following morning. 12 hours until salvation. Those final 12 hours proved almost harder to endure than the preceding 13 days. The men lay in concealment positions within visual range of the landing zone, their minds struggling to accept that survival was actually possible. Some slept. Some stared at nothing. Fletcher maintained watch, his eyes fixed on the open ground where the helicopter would land, counting minutes with the patience he had learned decades ago on a cattle station in Queensland. The Iroquois appeared precisely on schedule, its distinctive sound reaching the patrol perhaps 30 seconds before the aircraft itself became visible. Fletcher popped a smoke grenade to mark their position. The helicopter adjusted approach, flared, and touched down in a cloud of dust and vegetation debris. 5 men who could barely walk staggered toward the open doors. Hands reached out to pull them inside. The helicopter lifted off before the last man was fully seated. The flight to Nui Dat took approximately 25 minutes. Fletcher's patrol spent those 25 minutes in a state somewhere between consciousness and collapse. Medical personnel were waiting when the helicopter landed. What they found shocked even veterans who had seen the worst the Vietnam War could produce. The 5 men had lost an average of 18 kilograms each over 14 days. Their body fat had been entirely consumed. Their muscle tissue showed signs of breakdown. Their kidneys were failing. Their cardiovascular systems were barely functional. By every medical standard, these men should not have been alive. They should not have been capable of walking onto that helicopter. They certainly should not have been capable of completing a combat mission of strategic significance. But they had. The debriefings began 3 days later, after the medical staff had stabilized the patrol members enough to permit extended conversation. Intelligence officers recorded every detail of the 14-day odyssey. Tactical analysts mapped every movement, every engagement, every decision point. The resulting documentation ran to several hundred pages of classified material that would influence special operations doctrine for decades to come. The airstrike guided by Fletcher's patrol had eliminated an NVA divisional headquarters responsible for coordinating operations across a significant portion of the enemy's southern operational area. Subsequent intelligence analysis suggested that the destruction of this facility disrupted NVA command and control for approximately 6 weeks. During that period, enemy operations in Puoc Tuy province decreased by nearly 40%. Allied casualties dropped correspondingly. The strategic impact of one 5-man patrol had exceeded what entire battalions had achieved through conventional operations. But the tactical lessons proved equally valuable. Fletcher's patrol had demonstrated that human endurance extended far beyond accepted medical parameters when properly selected and trained individuals were placed under extreme stress. They had proven that small unit survival depended more on mental discipline than physical resources. They had shown that aggressive mission completion remained possible even under conditions that would justify immediate abort by any conventional standard. American military observers studied the debriefings with intense interest. MAC-VSOG Command requested detailed briefings on Australian survival techniques. Special Forces training programs incorporated elements derived from Fletcher's experience. The rivalry between American and Australian Special Operations units shifted subtly, with American operators developing new respect for their Commonwealth allies. Captain Marcus Webb, the MAC-VSOG liaison officer who had witnessed the patrol's return, wrote a classified assessment that circulated at the highest levels of American military intelligence. His conclusion was direct and uncomfortable for an American audience. The Australians, Webb wrote, had achieved something that American doctrine said was impossible. They had not achieved it through superior equipment or numerical advantage. They had achieved it through a combination of selection standards, training methodology, and operational philosophy that American forces would do well to study. Webb's assessment recommended extensive knowledge exchange between American and Australian special operations units. The recommendation was approved in principle, but implemented only partially. Institutional pride and bureaucratic inertia limited the transfer of lessons learned. American Special Forces continued to operate according to American doctrine, modified only marginally by Australian insights. This resistance to learning would prove costly in subsequent conflicts. Techniques that Australian SAS operators had perfected in Vietnam had to be rediscovered by American forces in later wars. Survival methods that Fletcher's patrol had demonstrated were forgotten, and then painstakingly reconstructed by new generations of operators. The institutional memory that could have been preserved through systematic exchange was instead lost to professional jealousy and organizational boundaries. Sergeant Colin Fletcher completed his 3rd tour in Vietnam and returned to Australia in 1970. He remained in the Special Air Service Regiment for another decade, eventually rising to the rank of Warrant Officer Class 1. His service record remained largely classified throughout his career. The full details of his 14-day patrol were not declassified until more than 30 years after the events occurred. The other members of Fletcher's patrol followed varying paths. Corporal Danny Nguyen served 2 additional tours before transferring to intelligence duties. He later worked as a civilian analyst for the Australian Defence Intelligence Organisation, his linguistic skills and field experience proving valuable in understanding Southeast Asian security dynamics. Trooper William Mackenzie remained in the SAS until a training injury forced his medical discharge in 1973. He subsequently worked in telecommunications, applying the radio expertise he had developed in Vietnam to civilian applications. Trooper James Rutherford completed his military service and pursued medical education, eventually becoming a specialist in emergency medicine. His experience treating severe dehydration under field conditions informed his clinical practice for decades. He frequently lectured on survival physiology, using his own documented symptoms as case study material. Trooper Robert Wallace served the shortest post-patrol career, leaving the military in 1971 to return to his family farm in Western Australia. He rarely spoke of his Vietnam experiences, even to close family members. The long high mountains remained contested territory until the end of Australian involvement in Vietnam. The headquarters that Fletcher's patrol had destroyed was eventually rebuilt in a different location. The NVA command structure adapted and continued operations. The war ground on for years after Fletcher's patrol returned from their 14-day ordeal. But something had changed in the relationship between American and Australian special operations. The grudging respect that had always existed between the two forces deepened into genuine professional admiration. American operators, who had witnessed Australian methods or heard accounts of Australian achievements, began to question assumptions that had previously seemed unassailable. The best among them incorporated Australian techniques into their own practice, even when official doctrine did not acknowledge the source. This legacy of Fletcher's patrol proved more enduring than any single tactical victory. The demonstration that 5 properly selected and trained men could accomplish what massive conventional forces could not achieve influenced special operations thinking for generations. The proof that human endurance extended far beyond accepted limits changed how selection courses were designed and how survival training was conducted. The example of mission completion under impossible conditions established a standard that special operators worldwide still reference. The physical toll on Fletcher's team proved significant, but not permanent. All 5 men eventually recovered full health, though the recovery process required months of medical supervision and rehabilitation. The psychological impact proved more variable. Some team members processed their experience with minimal lasting effect. Others struggled with memories that surfaced unexpectedly for years afterward. All of them shared a bond that transcended normal military camaraderie, forged in 14 days of shared suffering that few other humans could comprehend. Fletcher himself rarely discussed the patrol in detail. When asked about his most significant military achievement, he typically deflected with self-deprecating humor. He attributed the patrol's success to his team members rather than his own leadership. He emphasized luck rather than skill. He downplayed the suffering rather than dramatizing it. This modesty was characteristic of Australian SAS culture, which valued quiet competence over public recognition. But those who served with Fletcher understood what the patrol had accomplished. They understood that leadership under those conditions required qualities that could not be taught or simulated. They understood that keeping 5 men functional through 14 days of physiological crisis demanded something beyond normal military capability. And they understood that completing a combat mission of strategic importance, while simultaneously fighting for survival, demonstrated a level of professional excellence that deserved recognition regardless of whether that recognition was sought. The story of Fletcher's patrol eventually entered the unofficial canon of Australian military legend. It was told in barracks rooms and training areas. It was referenced in selection courses as an example of what properly motivated operators could achieve. It became part of the institutional identity of the Special Air Service Regiment, one of many stories that defined what it meant to wear the sandy beret. American Special Operations developed their own version of the legend. In their telling, the story emphasized the tactical brilliance of Australian reconnaissance methods. It highlighted the failure of American doctrine to anticipate what small units could accomplish. It served as a cautionary tale about the costs of ignoring Allied expertise. And it preserved the memory of 5 men who had achieved the impossible, whether or not American official histories acknowledged their accomplishment. The long high mountains have changed considerably since 1969. The jungle has grown back over bomb craters and bunker complexes. The tunnels have collapsed or been filled. The trails that Fletcher's patrol walked have been overgrown and forgotten. But somewhere in that terrain, invisible to satellite observation or tourist visits, lie the traces of 14 days that redefined what special operations could accomplish. The coordinates that Fletcher transmitted on Day 8 remain classified. The exact location of the destroyed NVA headquarters has never been officially confirmed. The operational details of the airstrike are still restricted. These classifications serve no current security purpose. They persist simply because no one has bothered to declassify material from a war that ended half a century ago. But the lessons learned on those 14 days do not require declassification to remain relevant. The principle that human will can overcome physical limitation transcends any specific conflict. The demonstration that small units can achieve strategic impact through precision and stealth applies to any operational environment. The proof that proper selection and training can produce operators capable of the impossible continues to guide Special Forces development worldwide. Fletcher passed away in 2015 at the age of 70. His funeral was attended by special operations veterans from multiple nations. The eulogy was delivered by a retired American Special Forces colonel who had spent his career studying Australian methods. The colonel spoke about professional respect across national boundaries. He spoke about lessons learned and lessons ignored. He spoke about 5 men and 1 canteen of water and 14 days that should have been impossible. And when the ceremony ended, the veterans who attended did not disperse immediately. They stood in small groups, sharing stories that would never appear in official histories. They remembered colleagues who had not survived to see old age. They honored traditions that connected them across decades and continents. They preserved memories that institutions failed to maintain. The story of Fletcher's patrol lives in those conversations. It lives in training manuals that cite anonymous examples of extreme endurance. It lives in selection courses that push candidates beyond what seems survivable. It lives in the quiet pride of operators who know that their profession demands everything and accepts nothing less than complete commitment. 14 days, 5 men, 1 canteen, and a mission completed against every odd. This is what elite means. Not the equipment, not the budget, not the Hollywood mythology. Elite means continuing when continuation seems impossible. Elite means completing the mission when completion defies reason. Elite means becoming something that ordinary human limitations cannot define. The Australian SAS understood this. They built their entire organization around this understanding. They selected for it. They trained for it. They expected it as the baseline rather than the exception. And in August of 1969, 5 of their operators proved that the understanding was justified. The long highs have gone quiet now. The war that made them famous has faded into history. The men who fought there have largely passed on. But the standard they established remains. The proof they provided endures. And somewhere, in selection courses and training exercises and operational planning sessions, new generations of special operators measure themselves against what 5 Australians accomplished with almost nothing except the will to continue. That measurement is the true legacy of Fletcher's patrol. Not the destroyed headquarters. Not the intelligence collected. Not even the lives saved by disrupted enemy operations. The true legacy is the knowledge that human capability extends further than human reason suggests. The true legacy is permission to attempt the impossible because others have proven it possible. This is what they survived for. Not just for themselves, not just for their mission, but for everyone who would follow them into situations where survival seemed unlikely and success seemed impossible. 14 days, 1 canteen, 5 men who refused to stop. This is the story that American military planners tried to classify. This is the story that Australian modesty tried to downplay. This is the story that institutional boundaries tried to contain. But stories like this refuse to be contained. They spread through professional networks and training communities. They inspire operators who never knew the men involved. They establish standards that subsequent generations struggle to match. And they remind us that special operations is not ultimately about technology or resources or numerical advantage. It is about human beings who have been selected and trained and motivated to do what other human beings cannot imagine doing. Fletcher's patrol did not imagine 14 days in the long haze. They simply did what the next hour required. Then the next. Then the next. For 336 consecutive hours. They did what the moment demanded, without considering the accumulated weight of all the moments before. This is the secret that no training manual fully captures. This is the quality that no selection course reliably identifies. This is the capability that separates operators who complete impossible missions from operators who attempt impossible missions and fail. The Australians called it the Grey Man Syndrome. The Americans called it different names over different eras. But the quality itself transcends terminology. It is the ability to persist without drama, to endure without recognition, to continue without requiring anyone to acknowledge that continuation is remarkable. 5 men walked out of the long high mountains possessing this quality in demonstrated form. They proved it not through tests or simulations, but through 14 days of actual survival under conditions that should have been fatal. Their proof remains valid across all subsequent decades and all subsequent conflicts. And their story, finally told without classification restrictions or institutional filters, takes its place among the defining narratives of special operations history. Not the most dramatic story, not the most publicized, but perhaps among the most instructive, because the lesson is simple even if the execution is almost impossibly difficult. When everything fails except will is enough. When resources run out, human determination can substitute. When the mission seems impossible, proper operators complete it anyway. 14 days, 1 canteen, 5 men, and a standard that endures forever.